So I'm very delighted to welcome our speaker for today, who is Dr. Peter Rebeiro, someone I've known for well over a decade now, who will be talking about his work in epidemiology and in particular Medicaid expansion and the Affordable Care Act as it intersects with the care of individuals living with HIV. So as part of a brief bio, Peter is one of the few people I know who's actually native to Nashville, and he has been involved in this field for quite some time, and in fact worked at the Comprehensive Care Center during his summer vacations during high school and college. He received his BA from Yale University in 2005. And interestingly, at that time, he was also a nationally ranked Quiz Bowl champion, which if you're familiar with Quiz Bowl, it is a high speed, high stakes, high intelligence, sort of broad test of knowledge, including history, literature, science, fine arts, current events, popular culture, all of these things where two teams compete, but really sort of a Renaissance breadth. And then after he finished at Yale, he then returned to Nashville, and he worked as a research assistant and coordinator in the CFAR Epidemiology Outcomes Unit here at Vanderbilt from 2006 to 2010. He then left for Baltimore, where he pursued a master's in biostatistics, followed by a PhD in epidemiology. And then from the Bloomberg School of Public Health, and then we successfully recruited him back here to Vanderbilt. So his research focuses largely on quantifying measurement error, assessing quality of care, and analyzing spatial and contextual factors related to the HIV continuum of care, as well as TB treatment outcomes in North, Central, and South America. He continues to pursue his collaboration with the Epidemiology Outcomes Group. He is also one of the associate directors of our data science core for the CFAR. He's also heavily involved with the COSANET collaboration and continues to be heavily involved with NACORD as well as the broader IDEA consortium. He is also the regional, he also works with Report Brazil. And then finally, on the academic side, he is the director of our Vanderbilt Epidemiology PhD program. So with that, I'll turn it over to Peter. So take it away.
Thanks so much, John. I'll go ahead and share my slides and make sure, thank you, first of all, for being so kind to talk about my Quiz Bowl history, which I don't often get to talk about. If anybody's curious what it looks like, there's not really a great American TV show equivalent, but in the UK, if you go on YouTube and look for University Challenge, that's probably the closest equivalent, and it's just as super nerdy as you could imagine. But anyways, I'm happy to join you today to talk about Medicaid expansion, and the title of my talk is what Medicaid expansion does and doesn't do for people with HIV, or how I learned to stop worrying and love the ACA. Hopefully some people get that movie reference. Will pop up again a couple times here, and strangely topical, but in any case, my disclosures are just that I have NIH funding. And with that, let's jump in to the topic at hand. So first, I'll talk a little bit about background on HIV and the care continuum in the US, then HIV-related health policy, what's known, what's unknown, and that area or that portion will focus more on my own work more recently, and then what's next, or what's left to work on. So just a reminder from CDC, this is now a couple years old, but this is the most recent data available for HIV incidence in the US. It did drop a little bit in the last few years during or right around COVID, and then following COVID has remained relatively steady, though, in those few years, around 31,000 new cases. Just as a bit of trivia, if you know your US population statistics, you will know that approximately 40% of the US population is in the South region of the US, which is defined, these are census-defined regions. But so 40% of the US population is here, but we account for 50% of the incidence, and roughly the same in HIV prevalence. We actually also, as not shown, is we lead as a region And I say we because I'm here in Tennessee, and our CFAR is the Tennessee CFAR, but I think several of you are joining from southern states. So we also lead in poor HIV outcomes, so HIV case fatality and progression to AIDS. So not great things to be leaders in, but that's where we are. And then just as an indicator for how our um, test and treat strategy might be going, we're actually lagging the Northeast. So the Northeast had 92% of people who knew their status in 2022. We only have 84%. That's roughly the same as in the Midwest. But again, remember that we bear the much disproportionate burden of HIV and advanced HIV disease. So that's a bit more of a problem as far as actual burden of healthcare needs in our region. And just a peek at the continuum of care regionally. Again, the third row, the purple row, is the South. And here, after we make it through the first portion of the care continuum, so at least linkage to care, our retention and our viral suppression isn't much lower than other regions, but still obviously a lot of work to be done. And I would point you to some of you do global HIV work in other regions around the world, and would probably note that once individuals are linked to care in other regions of the world, at least up until this year, we could proudly boast that some areas, especially those supported by USAID, PEPFAR, Global Fund, actually had viral suppression rates in the high 80s or even the 90s. So clearly a lot of work to be done here in the US. This is just a peek at health disparities. I know this is a no-no word. There will be probably several other, no-no words I say in this talk. But this is from a very nice collection about the US HIV epidemic from a few years ago now in the Lancet. And Patrick Sullivan and his group at Emory quantified different disparities. And I just want to point out, like, beyond kind of the racial disparities and the regional disparities, which I've talked a bit about, because that will come into play again. All of these things are linked because of sociopolitical and geographic realities. So talk a little bit about history. I'll talk about it a little bit more once we get to the current analysis or my recent work, but that's just something to be aware of. These disparities, they're quantified separately here and in many places, but they are linked. And one I would point you to is that the MSM heterosexual contact disparity is the greatest, and that obviously comes as no surprise to you. But it's a 150-fold difference in prevalence by risk group. And then it's important to note, I mentioned socio-political and historical and geographic reality. It's important to note that HIV isn't the only condition that shows these kinds of disparities across these regions and these groups. And again, these realities are linked. So if you looked at income inequality, so the Gini coefficient, if you looked at the proportion living in poverty, so below the federal poverty line, and if you looked at the proportion without health insurance, you'll see similar patterns. So how are these things linked? Important to remember this as we start talking about health insurance and the connection between health insurance and HIV care and HIV outcomes in the US, is the social ecologic model. And some of you may or may not have seen a recent interview in Politico. I think maybe it even just came out today with the current head of the NIH, Dr. Bhattacharya, where he questioned the use of things like diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, and said that things like structural racism, for example, are not really scientific constructs. I would push back on that pretty strongly and say that actually it's quite scientific because we have theoretical models that incorporate measures of structural racism along with other structural inequities. The social ecologic model is one of those, and not the only one. And beyond that, beyond having a theoretical construct or a conceptual construct of the effects or influences of structural factors on individual outcomes, we also have causal models where we can formulate how those factors may actually impact individual outcomes that we observe. And so, since we measure the structural factors and we measure the individual factors and we have a causal construct for it, we can design studies to try to assess that. And actually, one of these studies, my recent work on Medicaid expansion, is does try to incorporate some of these measures. And I think these are things that we can and should study as scientists, and obviously in a scientific manner. But to claim that they're beyond the scope of science because, as Dr. Bhattacharya put it, well, how would you intervene on such a thing, or how would you create a randomized experiment? I actually think maybe, just for lack of imagination, I could easily think of some randomized trials where you either have people, and these could be target trials, so purely conceptually, have people born into a society where there are structural factors related to society assigned race or ethnicity, and people born into societies where they're not. And then you compare them over time and look at their health outcomes and measure those and measure the influences of the structural factors on those individual outcomes and look at the differences. So we'll come back to these kinds of causal constructs and how they relate to what we've measured. But I just want to point out that we use this social ecologic model in HIV and many other theoretical models, but that take account of structural factors and institutional factors. Some of these are things like health insurance, and things like redlining, and these again are measurable factors that have bases in history and our own political and geographic reality. So I think we need to take account of that. Just as another theoretical model that underpins some of this work, the health behavior model is important to remember, and it's related to the continuum of care, or you can relate the continuum of care to the health behavior model in this fashion. And just remember that there are factors that precede linkage to care, retention in care, ART receipt, various laboratory outcomes and mortality, such as insurance status. So these are considered enabling factors. Your ability to access care in the US largely dependent on insurance status. For HIV, it's a little bit different. We'll talk about that. You obviously are familiar with that, but important to remember that these are all factors that influence downstream outcomes. So that's a little bit about just the context of HIV and the care continuum in the US. As far as national policy goes, again, I had mentioned access to care and health insurance being an important part of that in the US, and that generally is correct. There is also, for people with HIV, a special program, the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program, that supports treatment and care for people living with HIV. Especially if they have insufficient health coverage. There are multiple parts to the Ryan White Act and coverage, but just as a snapshot, in the US, about 570,000 individuals received Ryan White services in 2023. Remember, that's out of approximately 1.2 million people in the US living with HIV. And of the people in Tennessee living with HIV, almost 70% of them access services through the Ryan White program. So HIV is somewhat unique, not possibly completely unique, in the sense that there is this very robust safety net program for individuals if they don't have sufficient health coverage otherwise to access care and services. And that is not generally true beyond the scope of what we'll be discussing with Medicaid expansion. for people with other chronic diseases. And so just to note, in Ryan-White, as part of the program, they are very careful to monitor many outcomes, including care continuum outcomes. And among people receiving Ryan-White services, about 90% of them in the last year that was reported, which was 2023, actually reached viral suppression, which, again, pretty impressive. So a little bit of history on the HIV/AIDS policy of the U.S. The National HIV/AIDS strategy was actually only enunciated back in 2013 by the Obama administration. Before that, there wasn't actually a national strategy per se. And what the Obama administration did is they put together expertise. They had the Office of National AIDS Policy at the White House, which had been there, but they put together a presidential council and then used expertise from the Institute of Medicine, which is now it was then part of the National Academies, but now it's the National Academy of Medicine. And they did this in tandem with their health policy office. So they enunciated goals around care continuum benchmarks and integrated that with some of the outcomes that they had mandated that states receiving ACA funding would measure. So these are from the original Obama administration mandates around the national HIV/AIDS policy. Remember a little bit of history too, that the ACA was enacted in 2010, was originally or initially meant to begin in 2012 with Medicaid expansion beginning in 2014. But we'll come back to it in a second about how and why that didn't exactly happen the way that was anticipated. But just a little bit more about national HIV/AIDS policy, remembering too that during the first Trump administration, there was an Ending the Epidemic initiative announced that focused on counties and areas with high transmission and then with large rural epidemics. In Tennessee, we are not one of the states that it was identified, but Shelby County in Southwest Tennessee, Memphis, is an EHE jurisdiction, and we are surrounded by several other states that are EHE jurisdictions. And it hasn't been decided yet, I think, as far as I am aware, whether and how any of those funds may or may not be reallocated or slashed. But of course, we do know that CDC's HIV prevention office was pretty much demolished. And so I don't know at this point where or how any EHE plans will be funded moving forward. But obviously, this is a completely uncertain area, as much of U.S. health policy and just policy in general is right now. So under Medicaid, if you remember, before the ACA, and actually not just under Medicaid, insurance providers were able to deny coverage for pre-existing conditions. And so for people with HIV, if they had HIV, HIV counted as a pre-existing condition, insurance companies could deny them coverage. It was generally considered an uninsurable condition. So before 2010, that was the reality of being HIV positive in the US. So in most cases, people with HIV were pretty much barred from the individual insurance market. And then if they could get insurance, it was very, very expensive. And then they had annual and lifetime limits on coverage. So, not an ideal situation. In most states, you had to be both low income and categorically eligible. So either if you were a pregnant person or if you were a low income adult, you had to be classified as disabled separately in order to be insured under a state Medicaid program. And in Tennessee, for example, that is still the case. It is not purely income based as it is in other states. And then many individuals with HIV wouldn't actually qualify for Medicaid until they were very, very sick, often because of advanced disease. So they weren't really accessing preventive care and treatment. So as I mentioned, you think back to the ACA passing in 2010, as Joe Biden famously said, a big effing deal. And you think about all the changes that happened. So removing these exclusions for pre-existing conditions that directly affected people living with HIV. But there was also supposed to be a safety net expansion of Medicaid, largely through federal funding. But there was a lawsuit that made its way all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court decision in 2012, which was authored by the Chief Justice, still the Chief Justice of the U.S., John Roberts, basically said that states had the option to opt into Medicaid expansion, but they could not be mandated to expand Medicaid by the federal government. It was up to the states to decide, and that there could still be an individual mandate to obtain insurance. As many of you may realize, there is no longer a tax penalty for not having health insurance, although you still get those lovely 1095-C forms for your taxes. There is essentially no federal tax penalty if you did not actually have coverage for some portion of the year, which that was originally intent of the ACA as kind of the stick to go along with the carrots to diversify the risk pools and allow insurance companies to expand coverage. So that was dismantled later by a Republican Congress. But in any case, states were able to make the decision about whether they wanted to expand Medicaid or not. Many states in the subsequent years did. Something like close to 30 did in the first couple of years following the January 1st, 2014 deadline for expanding Medicaid. But as of today, it's up to 40 states. Tennessee, unfortunately, is one of the few remaining that has not. So there have been many studies done looking at what the impact has been even before the ACA on expanding Medicaid coverage. So there was a great study that was done back before the ACA passed, looking at Medicaid expansions in New York, Maine, and Arizona, which showed improvement in all-cause mortality. So lower all-cause mortality in states that expanded their Medicaid program versus control states. Also, as you may expect, decreases in uninsurance, so increases in coverage, and then decreases in delayed care because of cost, and then increase in rates of very good health. So probably increases in preventive care and treatment. So and some of those studies actually, there was a really great randomized study that was done in Oregon, because Oregon, when they expanded their Medicaid system pre-ACA, they actually did it through a literal lottery. So, there had been work done, and people in Vanderbilt's health policy department, several of them had participated in some of those studies and some of that work. And actually, as they were drafting portions of the ACA, there were several people in our health policy department here who actually helped get the ACA assembled. So more recently, after the ACA was enacted and looking at Medicaid expansion under the ACA, groups like the Kaiser Family Foundation have done studies showing that there have been reductions in infant mortality, increases in cancer diagnosis rates, so early stage diagnoses, which again you expect if you expand screening, increase in prescription medication to treat opioid use disorder, so MAT, and to treat opioid overdose. And that has actually been a point of contention in some of the current debate over cutting Medicaid benefits, and I'll come back to that in a little while. And then reduced probability of hospital closures, particularly in rural areas. Why is this important to us? Again, the South, the overwhelmingly the overrepresented group with HIV, poor HIV outcomes, is also overrepresented in rural hospital closures and rural healthcare setting closures. So not only do we have higher need, we have higher need in rural areas and largely rural areas than in other areas of the country, and we have fewer resources to meet those needs. So again, maybe a good reason for policymakers to consider expanding Medicaid. I include these figures even though they're a little bit older now because they were done by people who had really nice uh, uh, data visualization expertise available right after the implementation of the Medicaid expansion, and that was the New York Times back in 2016. And they did this very, very nice uh, piece where they covered expansion and the effects on the rate of uninsurance. And what you see is this pretty dramatic decrease. I think the national average at the time of the ACA passage was something like 18 to 19% of the United States, of adults or of individuals in the United States, were not insured. And you can see in county by county, in states, especially states that expanded Medicaid, but just in large swaths of the country, dropping to somewhere closer to 5 to 6% uninsured. And then if you looked in 2016, you could also see this pattern. Even when you looked county by county, you could actually see the delineation of states by who expanded Medicaid and who didn't. And so if you look, for example, at Tennessee, where we are, you can see several still very light colored counties, which means essentially the uninsurance rate hadn't shifted from 2014. But in states adjacent to us, like Arkansas and Kentucky, their uninsurance rate dropped pretty dramatically, close to 10%, because those states actually did expand Medicaid. And I will point out, in Arkansas, that happened under a Republican governor, Asa Hutchinson, and in Kentucky, it happened under Andy Beshear's dad, Steve Beshear, so a Democratic governor. So it's not strictly partisanship that controlled Medicaid expansion, but highly correlated, as you might suspect. So what else has been understood about the effects of Medicaid expansion? Generally speaking, for chronic diseases, as you might expect, it's increased screening, it's increased utilization of services. So it didn't decrease costs, but what it did is it decreased medical bankruptcies quite a lot, larger reductions in out-of-pocket medical spending, as you would expect. Improvement in regular checkups for chronic conditions, improvements in quality of care, even in areas that had relative shortages. And then also people receiving consistent care. So one of my areas of close study is retention in care. And so the idea that people maintain their medical care, they don't have disruptions in care, which is very, very important, as you know, for people living with HIV. But these patterns are seen across many different chronic diseases in many different states, in many different health insurance systems, or across many different health insurance systems. And more specific to HIV, Steve Berry and his group at Hopkins looked at Medicaid coverage among people living with HIV, accounting for Ryan White coverage of services in the immediate aftermath of the ACA and Medicaid expansion under the ACA. And they found, well, basically in states that did expand, their reliance on Ryan White didn't shift all that much. So it's not that expanding Medicaid made a lot of people come off of Ryan White, but then in states that didn't expand, you did see an increase, a dramatic increase in people relying on Ryan White. So it's kind of holding the status quo, or holding people stable, versus having, again, in areas of the country where there are more individuals having incident infection, and then more people who have prevalent HIV, them having higher need, and that need not being met because those are the very places where Medicaid is not being expanded. And so reliance on Ryan White there is increasing. So that's been studied a bit, but we still could ask the questions about, are people entering care earlier in places, people with HIV? Are they entering care earlier? Like, does the screening and diagnosis increase or improvement for other chronic conditions extend to people with HIV in states that did expand Medicaid? Are there people who are re-engaging in care who weren't in care before? Could there possibly be better rates of people staying on their ART and then maintaining viral suppression? And so we decided to look at some of those outcomes in a very large, nationally roughly representative HIV cohort study. So the NA Accord, many of you know, is one of the 7 regions of the Global IDEA collaboration, the International Epidemiology Databases to Evaluate AIDS. And the NA Accord has 26 participating cohorts. It's a cohort collaboration consortium, has over 200 sites active in the US and Canada, more than 190,000 individuals, about 1.3 million person years of follow-up as of last year. And I'm going to talk just for a moment briefly about a couple of different ways to think about the effects we might expect on HIV outcomes. And this is important. It'll become clear in a second because of how we're able to measure these. This applies in the circumstances I mentioned before about thinking about structural determinants and institutional causes of disparities, et cetera. But suppose I'm going to try and take you back to your kind of causal inference 101 here. Suppose you think about on an individual level all the different outcomes that an individual could experience under different exposures, under different treatment realities. So this is how we think about causality in epidemiology, is not just what's a cause and what's an effect, or not just through sufficiency, but what would have been experienced by an individual under a different treatment condition or under a different exposure condition. And so in the Medicaid context, you could think of something like, if you observe an individual in Tennessee with a particular trajectory of dealing with their HIV, what would that have looked like, or how would that have been different had they been living in a different state where their state expanded Medicaid and they were able to access other services, or just they were in a context where there was greater access to care. So something like that, right? So these are kind of the different realities. Think about like, what are the potential outcomes of an individual, or you may have heard the term the counterfactual outcome. So in English, we're left with the subjunctive if you're a grammarian. So if I were in the situation that is counter to fact, that is the counterfactual. So, for example, Tevye, if I were a rich man, right? So you can think of this on an individual level, but really that's just a philosophical exercise, because you can't measure an individual causal difference. It's called the fundamental problem of causal inference. And the reason is because once, as an individual, you experience some exposure, there is no way to observe the counterfactual you. There's no way to observe, your bizarro universe evil twin undergoing the same reality in all respects, except for the treatment assignment, or except for the exposure, which is what you would want to do if you really wanted to get at what's the actual effect of that exposure on you, right? Everything else should be identical except for the exposure. And then you look forward in time to see what happens with the outcome. But we can't do that. We don't have a time machine. We don't have a parallel universe investigation machine. I don't think even the physicists at the LHC think they have that access. So we're left with trying to come up with ways to approximate that kind of measurement using data that we actually can observe. And so we can think of a couple of different ways to quantify what those effects really are. You could think of comparing everybody in the exposed or the treated group in universe with their kind of counterfactual selves in a different universe where they weren't treated, and then measuring the kind of risk difference, or what's the difference in observed outcomes between those two groups. That would be the average treatment effect, okay? So this is typically how we define a cause or a causal effect, or how you think of one. And maybe when you're thinking of a randomized clinical trial and you want to know the effect of a particular drug on a particular outcome, you might often think of this average treatment effect. Another way to think about it is among the people who got treated or who actually received treatment, how big was the effect? So, what was the impact, for example, that Medicaid expansion made on HIV care for people who lived in states that at first didn't have Medicaid, but then had Medicaid expanded? Or states that had Medicaid, but they didn't have expanded Medicaid coverage and then expanded, right? So that's the average treatment effect on the treated, or the ATT. And these two things are distinct. I've described them distinctly. You can think of them distinctly. But also their estimators are distinct because those target quantities are distinct from each other. And the estimators that we can apply, or the methods we apply to trying to measure these effects, are different from each other, and they operate under some different assumptions. And they may present us with estimates ultimately that represent only one of those causal effects. So we need to be careful. That's why I reiterate that right now. We need to be careful about interpreting or inference when we use certain analytic methods to try to get at these questions. So in this study that we were interested in, looking at a cohort from the US, broadly representative of the US HIV epidemic, we used a few different methods. So trying to attack these questions from different angles analytically. Some of these were piecewise regression. We used generalized estimating equations, GE models, to look at saturated models that could accommodate region by time effects. These give you marginal effects. We looked at a difference in differences approach. For those of you who are more used to either policy analyses or econometric analyses, may be really familiar with these. And I'll describe what the approach is in a moment. We also used inverse probability weighted, or propensity score methods to match individuals on characteristics between expansion and non-expansion states. So this is probably a causal method that many of you are familiar with, trying to balance by confounding factors to try to eliminate confounding or potential sources of selection. And then there are also ecologic analyses, state level analyses, and actually, the diff and diff approach and the piecewise approach could also be ecologic. Here, we've made them individual level. But there are some truly ecologic analysis methods like synthetic control methods, and I'll describe that briefly in a moment. For all of these, we also actually did a leave one out analysis as a sensitivity analysis. So basically rerunning the analysis or bootstrap the analysis over and over, but each time removing one state at a time to see what the influence of inclusion of one particular state may be on the inferences. So just a look at if you did the piecewise regression approach, what you get a relative odds ratio. So remember that you're comparing two different things. You're comparing states that eventually expanded Medicaid versus states that did not. Okay, so there's your index and your referent. And you're also comparing outcomes in the period after Medicaid was expanded versus before. So you actually have two different comparisons occurring simultaneously. We have a control for the time period, that is the time before Medicaid expansion occurred, and we have a control for expansion states, that is states that did not expand. So how do you execute that? In a regression model like this, you can have an interaction, and that's why you end up with a relative odds ratios. So odds of expanding in a particular year divided by the odds of expanding in the year prior over the odds of not expanding in a particular year divided by the odds of not expanding in the year prior, right? So it's occurring in states that expand versus states that don't expand in the post-expansion period versus the pre-expansion period, right? So actually, this gives you a sense of this is, you could also describe this piecewise regression as a comparative interrupted time series, right? So you may be familiar with the interrupted time series, but now it's comparative, right? It's looking at two different groups in the after versus the before periods. For the difference in differences approach, you can also do this comparison, the treated group versus an untreated group in a treated period versus an untreated period. But here you are actually targeting an average treatment effect among the treated. There is a way to estimate over and get the average treatment effect, but the standard estimator is an ATT estimator, whereas the piecewise regression is an average treatment effect estimator. And then the propensity score matched regression is also an average treatment effect among the treated estimator. And then the synthetic control method, which I mentioned, which is an ecologic analysis, is actually an average treatment effect method. In this analysis, we actually use data up through 2018, and so it's pre-pandemic, and looked at states that had expanded up through that period and allowed for them to expand in different years because they did. So we actually had a time varying exposure as well. So all of these methods that I described before, they actually can also accommodate time varying exposures. That makes the model specification a little more complicated. So just as a brief look at our study population, we can look at the person time contributed into these different groups, right? So I mentioned a 2-by-2 comparison. So you have a group that eventually did expand Medicaid, but during the pre-expansion period, a group that never expanded Medicaid during a pre-expansion period, and then you have the group that did end up expanding Medicaid during the post-expansion period, and then the group that never expanded Medicaid during post-expansion years. And you can imagine for the group that never actually expanded Medicaid, you can ask, well, how do you figure out when they contribute to a pre versus a post expansion period? And the answer is they contribute in multiple years depending on which state you're comparing them to, right? So the control group is also shifting along with the exposure group over time. And the methods that we've used can accommodate that. There aren't huge differences to speak of except between these four groups, the expansion, non-expansion groups in pre versus post-expansion periods, except for with respect to race ethnicity, there is a bit of a difference. And if you think back to the map that I showed you of the states, even that's as of now, expanded versus didn't expand, and you look at the map that I just showed you in the study of those states that expanded versus didn't, you can think to yourself, again, there will be demographic differences if you know a little bit about the geography of the US and the demography of the US. But something to keep in mind, again, to push back on people who question the value of looking at structural inequities, remember also that there are historical and social political reasons for those demographic differences by geographic region. There are reasons that are structural and institutional that there may be differences, but one of the things that we can actually measure is the numerical difference here in socially identified race or self-identified race within these different groups. They are differently distributed in these different regions in these different time periods. The same is true of people who are at risk of HIV because of male-to-male sexual contact versus heterosexual contact, right? And again, if you think back to the map of the U.S. Comparing expansion and non-expansion states, you'd probably think in your head, yeah, that makes sense. So for these different outcomes that we looked at the common care continuum outcomes of clinical retention, ART use, initial viral suppression after ART initiation, and then CD4 count at enrollment. So as a kind of proxy for late diagnosis or late entry to care. An important assumption that underlies some of these methods, especially the difference in difference method, is having parallel trends in the pre exposure or pre-treatment period. You can, and actually you can extend it. It should be a conditional parallel trends assumption. You can see for some of these outcomes, they may not meet an actual strict parallel trends assumption unadjusted, but it is something we have to test for in the pre-period and the post-period. It does a little bit better when you look region by region. In the immediate pre-period, if you look at the highlighted solid and dashed lines. So strictly speaking, we probably meet the assumptions sufficiently for our methods, but remember again that we use multiple methods to look at these outcomes. So if we did, for example, a difference in difference approach and looked at what was the potential effect among states that expanded Medicaid of Medicaid on things like retention, art use, viral suppression, and CD4 at entry, what you actually see is there's not really much of a difference. There's pretty much a kind of a null effect on retention, art use, and viral suppression. There's a slight positive effect of Medicaid expansion on CD4 at entry. Here, the effect is about 20 cells. So on average, the interpretation is on average in states that expanded Medicaid, individuals could be expected to present to care with a CD4 count 20 cells per microliter higher than their counterparts in a non-expansion state in the post-expansion period compared to the pre-expansion period. However, if you actually limit, so you can kind of see from the plot that that effect kind of diminishes over time, and it looks like it's pretty sharp right in the first year or two after expansion. If you isolate it looking at just the initial year, which actually helps with some data sparsity in the initial CD4 counts, because as opposed to the other outcomes, which can be repeated, so things like clinical retention, you can be retained in multiple years or not retained. Viral suppression, you can be virally suppressed or not virally suppressed in multiple years. Obviously, you can be on ART or not in multiple years. For CD4 presentation, it only occurs once. And so there are far fewer individual observations contributed in a diff analysis to that particular outcome. If you isolate to just the first year after expansion, there's a larger effect. If you look at other methods like the propensity score, inverse probability of treatment weighted matched regression, looking at this individual ATT, you also see this improvement in CD4 count at enrollment. You also see this small improvement in viral suppression in Medicaid expansion states, but this is not the case in the other analyses. And then if you look at an ecologic analysis, now remember the unit of observation for an ecologic analysis is an entire state. So at maximum here we have 51, we include District of Columbia as a state. And so the confidence intervals are quite wide. So essentially you see pretty much a null effect for Medicaid expansion for every outcome. But with multiple other approaches, we see a kind of a sustained effect with a higher CD4 presentation, which means potentially earlier diagnosis, right? So probably improved testing. And that is buttressed by other studies that have shown that improvement in Medicaid coverage or expansion of Medicaid in states increased HIV testing with larger impacts among younger individuals and Black men. Some reasons why maybe we found null effects for the other outcomes, though, probably because the NA Accord cohort includes only individuals who have successfully engaged in care. So if the impact of Medicaid expansion is more on individuals entering care or receiving care at first and not necessarily on their sustaining care, then you wouldn't expect to see an impact on some of these downstream care continuum outcomes. Another reason could be because things like ART receipt and viral suppression in the NA Accord cohort are already quite high. So there might be ceiling effects, right? If a group in one state has 90% viral suppression rates every single year, and the other group has 91 or 92%, there's just not very much variation available in the outcome anymore between treated and untreated groups. And so you might not expect to be able to see a difference anymore. The power is just not high enough with a sample, even with a very large sample. So there could be multiple reasons why you wouldn't necessarily see improvements in retention, for example. And then remembering again that people with HIV have a different ability to access care than people with other chronic conditions, at least up until now they have with Ryan White funding. So I always like to mention this, you know, basically what's past is prologue, comes from The Tempest. But we can't divorce ourselves from history, social political history, geographic history, just history in general. And so this idea that we can not study or ignore structural causes or institutional causes of health outcomes, I think is fallacious. And I think, especially from a public health perspective, does a real disservice to the public's health. So from a methodologic perspective, we've actually published a piece. It's under review right now, I think. But the PhD student who worked with us on this project, Julia Thome, actually she's now Julia is Dr. Thome, PhD, has published a very nice companion piece discussing the methods at length. But so what could the differences be if we had different methods, applied different methods, even though we used many different methods and had pretty robust inferences? So we could study this using other methods. Are there differences when we account for Ryan White spending at the individual level? We didn't have that data for NA Accord, right? So whether individuals actually were using Ryan White services and how much was being spent on their care, we didn't have that data at the individual level. And if we were able to incorporate that, would we have seen some kind of confounding by indication and been able to see then maybe more significant results for retention or ART receipt or viral suppression for Medicaid expansion? And then are there better ways to derive individual level or subject specific effects or policy relevant effects from quasi-experimental designs? These are ongoing discussions among methodologists. Some lingering policy issues. This is highly topical. It is being marked up, or has been marked up, in the House currently in the Tax Writing Committee, the Ways and Means Committee, to extend tax cuts for very wealthy people in this country and to cut large amounts of spending from Medicaid, and not just from Medicaid, but also from the subsidies under the ACA that allowed people not eligible for Medicaid to acquire health coverage. So we are now in the political space of talking about rescinding coverage, even though we had great success in pushing down the uninsured rate nationally and in many, many states, of now actually expanding the uninsured population again. So keep in mind, I told you all the different benefits that accrued to people who had expanded coverage, improved care, lower medical bankruptcies, improved screening and prevention, improved outcome, reduced mortality, improved health outcomes, reduced mortality. So we're in a place now where we're talking about rescinding a lot of that. And that's not specific to people with HIV, but that is specific to Americans who need health insurance and may not be able to afford it otherwise. And then more specific to HIV, the Ryan White program still exists, but HRSA, the HIV/AIDS Bureau within HRSA, which administers Ryan White, is being subsumed under a different organization within HHS. So AHRQ, others that have been kind of eliminated or reduced, massively reduced, are being reorganized. So HRSA is one of those. I think 600 employees were, had a reduction in force. And so, we don't know how the administration of Ryan White will proceed going forward. If you, as an individual private citizen, as an American, if you're an American and you're listening, are concerned about this, it's super easy to find out who to call. go to this website and you can look up your representative by zip code. You can go to the US Senate website and look up your US Senator. Give them a call. Calls work better than signing petitions and emails and letters. We've been told that many, many times by people who were congressional staff and who have worked as lobbyists. They listen to phone calls more, or they track the numbers of phone calls they get on certain issues. And so if you care about Medicaid coverage being slashed, or, HRSA being reorganized in DHHS, or any of those things, give them a call. They are marking this stuff up right now. It is going to budget reconciliation soon, this latest budget, which again extends tax cuts for very, very wealthy people, slashes Medicaid dramatically, and also allows the tax benefits for people to obtain health coverage on the marketplace to expire at the end of the year. So somewhere between 8 and 13 million people expected to be pushed off of having health care by the end of the year. I just leave you with a couple of quotes from Bertrand Russell, one that I've included perennially, which is about politics being focused on making individual lives as good as possible. And I say this also because Bertrand Russell was a philosopher, but also a mathematician. And if you feel that scientists shouldn't discuss policy or politics, I think it's important to remember that, Russell was very involved with Einstein. And, I guess if a scientist as great as Einstein could be politically involved in his times, which he very much was, especially anti-nuclear proliferation, hence the reference in my talk about Dr. Strangelove, then I think, we can be involved as scientists too in understanding how to be involved in policy, examining policy from a scientific standpoint, of course, and rigorously, but that we should be involved. And then speaking of nuclear proliferation, Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein both were very involved in trying to prevent nuclear proliferation. And he wrote this in a letter in the 1960s. And you'll notice, actually, he was very long-lived and very prolific through his whole life. He wrote this book in 1917, Political Ideals. And then he wrote this letter in 1963 when he was well into his 90s. But he said in a letter to the editor, every country which persecutes a minority in the name of national security is guilty. The guilt is the weakness and blindness to cruelty, which when widespread permit every and any atrocity. I say that the treatment of a society's worst offenders and most hated members is an indication of its own moral standard. If a society can in all conscience permit the cruel treatment of any man, ultimately it will allow it for all. I say that I think we need to be aware of what's happening in public health. We need to be aware of what's happening in the society around us. And so I just think it's good to reflect on that as we continue our work, do our best to continue our work. I know we're all trying our best to put one foot in front of the other. But the role of scientists and academics and intellectuals is to remain engaged with the society around them and with policymakers and with policy. So, obviously focus on your work, do the best work that you can, but realize that it redounds to the society around you. Thank you to all of my collaborators. I've had many, many collaborators. There's actually just a few of them. Through the NA Accord, through IDEA, through the CFAR. This is some of my funding and the funding that supported this work and other work that I'm still doing. And I'm very, very grateful for it. And I hope that it will be continued. So say thank you. If you have any questions, I realize we're about out of time, but I'm also happy to take questions on follow-up by email if you wish.